Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the Cyber Vigilance Podcast. So today I'm joined by special guest Jon from ThreatAware, CEO there. So, Jon, it'd be great if you could kind of tell us a little bit about the story behind ThreatAware and why it came to be.
Yeah, of course. So essentially, me and the co-founder Steve Thompson, we originally founded a MSP, London-based MSP, about 2008. We founded that, and it was through that working in that industry that we established that there was just this huge problem that we were facing that was becoming more and more prevalent. And it's an age-old problem, actually. It's a real simple one to understand, and it's simply getting a accurate number of every single device that we were ultimately responsible for, and then trying to ascertain whether all of the standard controls, nothing that fancy, just antivirus, patching, encryption, etc., whether they were actually deployed and functioning across all of those computers. And this problem came about in earnest probably about 6 or so years ago. And it was around, I don't know if you remember, but the WannaCry massive incident that affected obviously the NHS and many others. And that was all to do with, if you had one particular patch installed, then you wouldn't be affected by WannaCry. And I just wanted to get that accurate answer immediately. Okay, which machines didn't have it? But when you start digging into that problem, you quickly realize that you're probably using a traditional agent-based tool. Like in our case, we were using RMM. And so obviously if that agent isn't installed on the tool, then you're completely blind to it altogether. You have no idea about the machine. And then if the agent has a fault, it's not reporting the information back. So, and that's obviously a moderately sophisticated way of doing it anyway. Most people are actually only relying on spreadsheets. But the point being is that if you are relying on agents, that you're always going to have gaps. And we were acutely aware of that. So we established that if we actually connected in at source to all of the controls and then gathered all of that information, and then had some enhanced matching to create us that single source of truth, then we would have a clear picture, and then we'd actually know if those controls were actually deployed, functioning, and healthy. So yeah, that was the challenge that we had, and so we essentially made like a MVP of this at the time, not knowing that we would even make a product out of it. And yeah, the results were just incredible, to be honest. We just saw the discrepancy in the data that we previously had to what we had after the MVP. And we kind of instantly knew we were onto something. And naturally, we'd already looked for a solution to solve the problem. We didn't find one. So that was about 5 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago that we started doing that. And if you roll forward to now, we're protecting huge organizations. So we now focus on organizations that have sort of 1,000 to 100,000 employees, protecting sort of national infrastructure, power stations, global retailers, etc. So it was clear that everyone had that problem, not just us as a lonely MSP.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that's a great explanation. It's so nice to hear about a product that has that story where you've seen it in reality. You know what the problem is, and you've gone and resolved it, right? And we speak to tons of customers here at Cyber Vigilance that have that problem, and it all comes down to as well visibility, not actually knowing what you have. And I talk about it loads on this podcast about visibility. So it fits in. Really
I find that
common theme.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember we were speaking to a large bank a couple of years ago now, and there was I don't know, about 15 people from the bank, and they were saying they were they understood the problem very well, and they were impressed by what we could do. And they were sort of talking amongst themselves, so, how long have we had this problem for? And someone's like, well, probably 5 years. And then someone chimed in and said, well, more like 20 years. And I think that is actually the reality. It was as soon as the internet came about, this problem existed, but it's just got worse and worse and worse as, you know, cloud has obviously brought so many great things, but that flexibility where anyone can access corporate data from any machine has just created, you know, it's just made this problem just skyrocket.
Yeah. Everything, like, there's so many problems that have just exploded from migrated to the cloud, and obviously COVID as well, which accelerated that. And it's, yeah, the problem has just expanded within security in general as well. It's crazy.
I think it's so much of a problem now that people haven't been able to kind of get their arms around, that they actually just started coming up with different ways of categorizing the machines that they didn't have a hope of protecting, i.e. BYOD. I mean, what is that really about? It really is machines that they haven't purchased. They've got no way of protecting them, so they've just labelled them BYOD and sort of washed their hands with it. And I think we're really beginning to see, you know, the downside of that approach happening more and more now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it kind of segues nicely into a question I was going to ask, which was essentially, what are the biggest drivers behind ensuring good cyber hygiene in 2024? I suppose obvious one is you want to make sure you're protecting everything, but there's a real drive from like industry recognized standards that you're meant to adhere to now. A lot of people just think, oh, we've got EDR, we've got MFA, all these kind of things that are, you're meant to have for good cyber hygiene, but how do you actually know that they're working? So what would you say is the biggest driver at the moment for cyber hygiene and cyber asset management?
So the biggest driver, I mean, you have touched on a few of them there. I think that there's a lot of evidence now that, you know, that highlights that, firstly, the controls do really work. So, you know, MFA, don't want to state, it's something like 99.9% of attack, you know, will prevent that many attacks on a user attack. And then I think latest stats from Microsoft are in the region of, you know, 99% of all sort of endpoint related attacks are prevented by good cyber hygiene. And then, you know, sort of the interesting one is that I think it's like 80% of attacks are now originating from computers that are unmanaged, which really highlights that whole BYOD, you know, issue. So I think that's definitely a driver, that people are recognizing that A, this does actually work. B, obviously the number of attacks is just, you know, increasing year on year. It hasn't, you know, it's never plateaued, or it certainly hasn't gone backwards. So that's always, you know, it's evidence that this is a growing problem. And then I think that the the regulations are beginning to really catch up to this, and they're getting a lot more focused. I mean, you hear cyber resilience being a phrase that's chucked around a lot more now, and prevention, which is sort of like hallelujah at last. It is sort of painful to, you know, to be in a situation where you have so much focus on breach detection, when all the evidence is suggesting that breach prevention is the way, surprisingly, to prevent these attacks from happening. It wasn't long ago when I think it was something in the region of like 75% of budget, of cybersecurity budget, was being spent on detection. And I think it actually stems from I come from a technical background myself, and I think it more stems from the people in those roles. It's sort of like, it's exciting and more interesting to be the hero that, you know, finds that hacker and stops them in their tracks straight away. And there's a very important role in cybersecurity for that. It's critical. You can't just put your defenses in place and be like, oh well, let's just hope that no one, you know, gets in. I'm not
Yeah.
for a moment saying that breach detection isn't critical. It is, but you've got to have that prevention in place first, especially as we know how
Mhm.
effective it is. So I don't know
Yeah,
if that answers your
definitely.
question, but there's many drivers, I think, and I do think they're becoming
Mhm.
more prevalent with the latest regulations.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, and it kind of fits in with what I expected in the sense of there's there's so many things happening at the moment in the world in general, and like we mentioned with COVID and the cloud, as all these things are blowing up, and that is generally one of the key drivers. So yeah, completely answers the question. And I guess we've kind of spoken about this already, but the biggest challenges in ensuring good cyber hygiene, what would you say are the top things that are stopping people from having a good cyber hygiene program or strategy?
Well, I mean, it does definitely depend on the organisation for sure,
Hmm.
and sort of where they are in their cyber hygiene maturity level, um, and you know industry factors do play a part. The type of data that you're protecting, as to what level you're going to need to sort of scale this up to. But in terms of sort of where to start, it has to start with, as you said, visibility. If you don't, it's
Hmm.
just so basic. If you don't know what you're protecting, then obviously you haven't got a hope of actually protecting it. And it's really, we obviously connect to hundreds of different companies or environments, and there's always a very similar trend, which is totally understandable, which is that when companies connect in, they always think that they will have a much smaller number of devices that they're protecting than they actually do. And it's very
Hmm.
sort of clear as to why that would be, because obviously when you're looking at your devices through the tools that you're using, whether it's your EDR, whether that's your patching system, it will give you whatever number it is. So say it's 5,000 devices, then obviously naturally over time you're going to think that you have 5,000 devices, and you may only have maybe 50 in this other system and another 50 in that system. But with people having so many different systems and so many different tools, those numbers
Hmm.
quickly add up. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely getting that visibility, and um, I guess just being open-minded and sort of really and curious about, hold on, am I confident in this, and why am I confident in that answer?
Hmm.
And questioning it is definitely the first thing. So yeah, it has to be visibility, really.
Yeah, and I think, like you said about there's so many tools that people are using now, and I think a recent ESG report on cyber hygiene and posture management claimed that 32% of organizations were using 20 to 30 different security tools, which is mental. And being able to collate all the information from all of those and truly understand what your landscape looks like is ridiculous. And like you said, if being open minded, not just assuming that everything is in place where it should be, um, that's so important. And yeah, all comes down to visibility as well, like we mentioned.
Yeah, those stats,
Um,
they'd always fascinate me, because obviously, as a cyber asset management platform, we'd always love to say that people have hundreds of tools, and the more the
mhm,
better. But yeah, 32. I mean, I'm guessing they must be factoring in all of the external scanners and like literally every
mhm,
security tool. But from an endpoint perspective, we typically see about 12 to 16 is kind of like including
yeah,
like your directories and that sort of thing.
yeah, and I mean that's still quite a lot, I would say. If you're a small security team, being able to manage that is a
Yeah, and I
lot.
haven't come across a big security team. I haven't met a security team yet who
Yeah,
said, "Oh yeah, we're just swimming in resource at the moment."
yeah,
They
the
all seem
vibe,
pretty
yeah.
stretched, to say the least.
Especially at the moment. I guess that is kind of a challenge in itself, just when you're talking about cyber hygiene, is resource and time. And we've got all these tools, it's more than ever, more assets than ever. It's just creating more problems. And um, it's hard to be able to manage all of those things. And a lot of traditional ways of assessing what your landscape looks like is also just one moment in time, right? You're not continuously, you don't have someone there 24/7 seeing what changes are happening, whether everything's working correctly. You're just looking at once a month or once a week, those kind of things.
There's also, I think there's a huge misconception in that if you just export all of your data from each of the different systems, and most clients we'll be dealing with will have at least sort of 5,000 devices as a minimum, and you're bringing all of those devices, downloading all the data from all the different consoles, going to put it into good old Excel. Now, even if you are like an absolute Excel guru, there's still so many issues that you won't be able to solve. So, for example, if tools have been reinstalled, then when they get reinstalled on the operating system and they re-register into the console, they'll have that, bracket 1, because there's actually 2 computers with exactly the same name and it's the same computer. Now, if you're pulling those from multiple lists, then how are you going to know which one was actually correct? Were there actually 2 computers, or was it actually 2 unique computers? You won't be able to tell. And multiple problems like that mean that it is nigh on impossible, like literally impossible, to be able to get that perfect single source of truth. Then you've got to validate it against all those different tools. And however long that takes you, you've then got to do it again, as you just said. When are you going to do it? Like, what, the next day, the next week? I mean, we're dealing with a client at the moment, and they had one person who was spending a week of their time just to try and correlate that list. And then when we plugged in, they had about 10,000 devices, I think. When we plugged in, we immediately found 12,000. And that's nothing to do with how hard and how well that person was working. It just doesn't work. It's impossible. It's too much. It's not a manual. It's not a manual. It's not a human challenge. You've got to get computers to be able to do this, and it's got to be done just continually. Because then once it's done continually, you then embed it into your process. So then it becomes part of your life cycle management, and then you're bulletproof before you've even deployed that server or given that laptop to the new starter, which is vital.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy that you're saying about how they actually had 12,000 devices, because we've heard of similar situations where people had devices in locations they didn't even know about. And how are you meant to? How is a person meant to be able to understand that? You need the assistance of tools to be able to do that, because, like you said, it's impossible. And we were saying about spreadsheets, the same report I spoke about earlier, it says that there are 73% of professionals admit that their security hygiene and posture management is dependent on spreadsheets.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Yeah. And the other thing is, well, the person who collated that was highly skilled, and that's just not a good use of their time. So if they just had the instant answer of here are all the problems, then they can actually spend their time solving those problems instead of just trying to work out what the problems are.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big thing that we have internally at Cyber Vigilance when we speak into customers. It's all about that resource time, and making sure that they're prioritizing their time on things that are truly valuable, and not saying that that isn't valuable, but
it's not
if you
effective
have a
though.
tool that does it, it's not effective use of time. Exactly. Yeah. So, um, completely agree with all of those points. So I guess the next point I wanted to cover was, we've kind of overlapped onto it already, is how do we actually ensure we have good cyber hygiene implemented? And obviously we've spoken about people relying on tools such as Intune or spreadsheets collating information from other all the tools together. It's not a good use of time, and you don't actually get an accurate vision of what your landscape looks like. And people have so many tools. We've kind of already covered that part, but it's all about implementing something that's dynamic, up to date, and also ensuring that, like you said, your controls are all in place across all of your security stacks. So is your EDR actually across all of your endpoints? I know we were dealing with a customer that didn't know that their managed service that they had for their EDR wasn't actually implemented across their entire environment and wasn't adhering to best practice.
Yeah,
And it
we
makes
come
us
across
think,
that
oh, is this?
more often than you'd think.
Yeah.
And the well, there's lots of challenges there. I mean, the first one is that you can't rely on one agent-based tool to be your single source of truth. And people will try and use different, make one of those tools, their single source of truth. Like, for example, it might be Intune. It could be your CMDB. But whenever we've seen that, whenever people have tried to do that, there's always gaps because there's other complexities within the environment that they have considered and they're aware of, but it just basically puts a spanner in the works. So, for example, you might have some Macs, and the Macs are going to be controlled by Jamf, or you aren't able to keep your CMDB up to date because it's just an impossible task in itself. And so there isn't something in between saying, okay, well, I can see that many computers here, I can see that many here, and there's a disconnect, and then giving you that true picture. You've then got the problem of the machines not being enrolled in the first place, or the machines have been enrolled, but then the tool that was supposed to automatically install the controls isn't working, or it did get rolled out into Intune, but then it stopped communicating back again. There were just so many problems that start happening, and then you start adding in larger environments where there may be doing a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and now they've brought in a new company and they've got the same tools. And so now how do you know whether you're on, the company A's EDR or the new company's EDR that you've just bought and you want to move them all over there? It doesn't take long before it's just an absolute mess. And then with any large company, you've just got so much constant change anyway, just of starters and leavers, and moving over to new products, etc. And then you get updates from product. The list goes on and on. So you just have to have a third-party tool that is completely agnostic to all of them. It is completely agentless and is being that single source of truth and gathering all of that information from all of the different systems and then creating a perfect single source of truth. And that in itself is so difficult to achieve. What we've witnessed, so we've obviously, as I said from the start, we've been doing this for like the last 5 years. We're actually one of the pioneers in this space. When we started, we weren't classifying ourselves as a cyber asset management. It wasn't really a thing then. But as it's evolved, that's what everything has sort of moved towards. But what we've recognized is there are becoming lots more competitors in this space now. And what we're seeing the majority of them doing is just gathering the data, putting it into a graph database, letting the graph database match the relationships, and then just give you the relationships between those different assets. Whereas we are completely different to that. And I think that's because, kind of as you alluded to at the start, is because we had an actual problem that we needed to solve. And so the way we do it is we actually gather all that data, we do standard metadata matching that you'd expect, but then we do our patent pending timeline matching on top of that. And that allows us to match with not even using metadata. It's purely on when the machines are checking in. And so this creates that perfect single source of truth. The reason I mention that is it just highlights how much effort and innovation is required to create that perfect single source of truth when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of devices, which is why I think it is a 20-year-old problem. So I always see it as a simple problem to understand, a really difficult problem to solve.
Yeah, no, completely agree with all of that, and all of the conversations that I've had with customers here at Cyber Vigilance, as soon as we get on a call with them to present ThreatAware, they all say the same thing. It's all about not knowing what they actually have, and it's a problem that they know they have and they don't know how to solve. And it's every single one. They say the same thing. Is they didn't know how to solve it, and tools like ThreatAware and being able to do the multiple correlations and actually give you an accurate view is so vital to them. Um, so I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. And from our side, one of the main reasons why we wanted to partner with ThreatAware, because it is a pioneer in the market, and it's you see that instant result from customers when you speak to them, and it's yeah, solving a 20-year-old problem. So yeah, no, that's great. And I think we've kind of covered quite a lot here, and I really appreciate your insight into the market, the industry, the problems that you see, the challenges, and how we can solve them moving forward. So thank you very much for joining me on today's episode.
No, thanks a lot for your
And
time.
thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and we will join you on the next one. Thanks.